A few weeks back, after a long gap, I decided that I had to resume one of my favorite activities, walking around without purpose. Because of the lockdown, I had mostly stayed indoors, stirring out for the occasional work call or to meet a friend while maintaining physical distancing rules. I'd almost forgotten how much I enjoyed walking around the city. Growing up in Kolkata, most of my friends and I used to go to school in buses. It was only in my final 3 or 4 years of school that I started availing public transport, and I slowly began to appreciate the joy of freedom in the streets. After I entered university, I suppose I started craving more of it. Staying with my parents for the most part, my sleep pattern changed radically as I wanted to feel alone, to be myself late into the night. Um, it didn't matter that they hardly ever imposed any restrictions on my comings and goings. Similarly, taking long, meandering walks back from university became a part of my routine. I didn't really go anywhere specific. Because I had time to kill, I would walk aimlessly till I felt happy and exhausted. It was a way of, escaping from the very idea of a routine, I suppose. It was a kind of escape into a world that was of my own making, where no one told me which streets I have to take or which corners I have to turn. It was like writing a new story every day on my walks, piecing together different parts of a familiar neighborhood in new sequences, like stringing together new sentences. Interestingly, although it wasn't always easy for me to connect to the texts that we studied as English literature students to my personal experiences, I found very strong resonance of my love for walking in many writers. Whether in the countryside or in cities, poets and novelists since the Romantic age seem to have written quite often about the joys of walking. For some, like William Wordsworth, it was very clearly connected with the process of composing lines of poetry. Take, for example, this account by his sister Dorothy Wordsworth in a letter written to a friend in 1804. At present, he is walking and has been out of doors these 2 hours, though it has rained heavily all the morning. In wet weather, he takes out an umbrella, chooses the most sheltered spot, and there walks backwards and forwards, and though the length of his walk may be sometimes a quarter or half a mile, he is as fast bound within the chosen limits as if by prison walls. He generally composes his verses out of doors, and while he is so engaged, he seldom knows how the time slips away, or hardly whether it is rain or fair. Now, when you come to think of it, even in his best known poems, you find these references. Think of him wandering lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, before chancing upon the daffodils, whose memory would stay with him forever. I remember one of our teachers saying quite dismissively, "Why do you study this? Have you ever seen a living daffodil?" Now, I was in my first year, and so I couldn't say it out loud, but I thought to myself, even if I haven't seen a living daffodil, I have experienced the joy of discovering a sight that stays with you for a long time, so I don't really mind studying it. But it was not Wordsworth but Virginia Woolf who gradually became my favorite writer on the theme of walking. It took me a bit of time to get used to her style, because it is so different from what I had read in the past. But when I did get into it, I could think of no better way to write about walking or even about the city. Her lines carried the exact rhythm to which her characters walked. They drifted in and out of memories as they stepped off the curb and waited for a bus to pass before crossing the street. They allowed you to read very quickly for a few pages before slowing down to really savor the words and images that drifted into a character's imagination. Just as an example, let's read this passage from Mrs. Dalloway. She, this is Clarissa Dalloway, the protagonist, had reached the park gates. She stood for a moment looking at the omnibuses of Piccadilly. She would not say of any one in the world now that they were this or were that. She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. She sliced like a knife through everything, at the same time was outside looking on. She had a perpetual sense, as she watched the taxicabs, of being out, far out to sea and alone. She always had that feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. Not that she thought herself clever or much out of the ordinary. How she had got through life on the few twigs of knowledge Fräulein Daniels gave them, she could not think. She knew nothing, no language, no history. She scarcely read a book now, except memoirs in bed. And yet, to her it was absolutely absorbing, all this. The cabs passing, and she would not say of Peter, she would not say of herself, I am this, I am that. Now, apart from the beauty of Virginia Woolf's prose, her writing about women navigating the city of London in the 1920s is significant from the perspective of gender studies, and that is another reason why I was drawn to her writing. The city in literature, as in real life, has traditionally been represented as a very male space, where the poets climbed down from the Scottish Highlands and started walking around in the cities that were being shaped by the Industrial Revolution. Women of the middle and upper middle classes did not have much by way of access to public spaces. The coffee houses were dominated by men, and even in public transport, the fashion of the day hardly permitted women easy mobility. They were mostly shuttled from one part of town to another in carriages, protected by men, from men. And how could it be any different when, even within the public sphere, by which I mean the world of print, of newspapers, pamphlets, and books, women were allowed a relatively late entry? When male poets wrote about the city, they imposed what is known as the male gaze, or a particularly male way of seeing. How was this reflected in writing? It was noticeable in the selection of things they chose to write about and their ways of describing or engaging with them. Repeated articulations of the male gaze in poetry and novels resulted in the creation of a wider discourse from which women were excluded. When they did feature in the city, they were written about as objects of male visual pleasure. Take, for example, these lines by the French poet Charles Baudelaire. The street about me roared with a deafening sound. Tall, slender, in heavy mourning, majestic grief, a woman passed with a glittering hand, raising, swinging the hem and flounces of her skirt. Agile and graceful, her leg was like a statue's, tense as in a delirium. I drank from her eyes, pale sky where tempests germinate, the sweetness that enthralls and the pleasure that kills. Or, take for example these lines that one of Virginia Woolf's closest friends, the writer Lytton Strachey, wrote to her in a letter in April 1916. Who has not, down the street with a fond eye, gone vaguely voyaging, love's secret spy? Searching with subtle glance the moving crowd for some new beauty, sweet or quaint or proud, lingering amid the thronging thoroughfares. Thus, loitering in the streets without a purpose was a predominantly male pastime, and people who indulged in it as a new form of urban recreational activity came to be known as flaneurs. The problem, of course, is not so much with loitering itself, but in creating and propagating discourses that make it an exclusionist practice. In a remarkable essay on the visibility of women in city streets, Susan Buck-Morss writes that for men at the time, flânerie was not only a socially recognized activity, it was almost celebrated. But for women to be out in the streets without any specific reason had moralistic implications. They were regarded as tramps or sex workers, which genteel society was desperate to avoid as if it was a bad thing. She notes that at the time the phrase street walker became synonymous with prostitution, signifying the moralistic overtones for women who enjoyed walking the city. It is not that women did not write about their mobility in public spaces at all. Take for instance the poet Amy Levy, who became the first Jewish woman to enter Cambridge University. In the late 19th century, she wrote a beautiful description of her experience of riding a bus, when most women would have kept this rare secret pleasure to themselves. She writes, "Some men to carriages aspire, on some the costly hansoms wait. Some seek a fly on job or hire, some mount the trotting steed elate. I envy not the rich and great, a wandering minstrel, poor and free, I am contented with my fate, an omnibus suffices me. In winter days of rain and mire, I find with a corner straight, the busmen know me and my lyre, from Brompton to the Bull and Gate. When summer comes, I mount in state the topmost summit, whence I see Croesus look up compassionate, an omnibus suffices me." So, even though we cannot regard Woolf as the first woman to write about women in public spaces, in her letters, diaries, essays, and fiction, she transforms it into more than a visually thrilling experience. It offers her a unique opportunity to delve into questions of space, of time, and of memory, and explore these through the physical experiences of her characters as they negotiate male-dominated urban spaces of London. Let us begin our analysis, which we will continue in the next episode as well, by comparing three opening passages from three texts by Woolf. Mrs. Dalloway, which was written in 1925, Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, the short story written 2 years earlier in 1923, and a later essay titled Street Hunting, a London Adventure, written in 1930. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the gloves herself. This is from Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, 1923. Mrs. Dalloway, the novel begins, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. So from gloves, she changes it to flowers. And finally, Street Haunting starts with the passage, "So when the desire comes upon us to go street rambling, the pencil does for a pretext, and getting up we say, really, I must buy a pencil. As if under cover of this excuse we could indulge safely in the great pleasure of town life in winter, rambling the streets of London." In the 1923 short story, the attempt to buy gloves is a rather frustrating one, as Mrs. Dalloway struggles to find the right size. But in Mrs. Dalloway, the novel, she successfully purchases the flowers from Miss Pym at Mulberry's, the florist's. Both attempts, however, are interrupted by the loud noise of a car tire bursting. Many of those who hear its sound mistake it for a pistol shot. In the years immediately after the First World War, loud noises often brought back memories of gunshots and airplane propellers, worst affecting those who were actually on the war front. In the essay titled Street Haunting, the narrator also manages to buy the pencils eventually, but at the shop she is witness to a quibble between the elderly couple who run the shop, which makes her realize how much one can inadvertently learn about the lives of others while going on such a simple mission as buying a few pencils. One thing that becomes quite clear is that there has to be some excuse for a woman to step out of her home. If we think back to Susan Buck-Morss's point about how it was unacceptable for women of a certain class to walk aimlessly about, we realize that this is a necessary condition, even if she doesn't have to spell it out to someone else. It is a habit that she has internalized, where she must find an excuse, find a reason for her to step out of the home. What is perhaps most important is that in literary history, Woolf here inaugurates a new visuality in the urban space that moves away from the male gaze, marked by its claims of objective representation and empiricism, as was common in detective stories of the time. So, even if the male gaze wasn't objectifying the woman, what Woolf would identify as this kind of a Victorian way of looking at the city is something that would pick out small details and try to construct characters through them, And if you think about Victorian novels, if you think about, say, Charles Dickens or any of the other Victorian novelists, they often tend to draw characters by focusing on these minute details, as if the details themselves help us understand this person. The problem with this was that in detective fiction and in other forms of writing, which were also very predominant in the colonies, these methods were often used to create ethnologies, which would be basically like a dictionary of human beings, where their characteristics would be catalogued, categorized, and it was assumed that only through this act of categorization, of cataloging details, that you could understand a race or an individual or even a species. So this is very strongly, this is something that is very strongly present not just in Victorian science writing, but also in Victorian novels, which becomes a kind of predominant mode for the realist form of writing. So what Virginia Woolf does also is kind of an opposition or a contradiction of that realist mode of representation, with all its implications of ethnological understanding of human lives and human beings. So unlike Sherlock Holmes, who is an expert at telling everything about a person simply by looking at the soil that sticks to their boots or the stain of a single fingernail, Woolf offers us a more empathetic reading of the scenes and characters we witness on the streets. For her, knowing someone does not involve working out these specific details, but the ability to imagine their lives, to step into their shoes and walk around in them. We'll close with two passages that illustrate this point. In the 1930 essay, Street Haunting, she writes, "Into each of these lives, one could penetrate a little way, far enough to give oneself the illusion that one is not tethered to a single mind, but can put on briefly for a few minutes the bodies and minds of others. One could become a washerwoman, a publican, or a street singer. And what greater delight and wonder can there be than to leave the straight lines of personality and deviate into those footpaths that lead beneath brambles and thick tree trunks into the heart of the forest where live those wild beasts, our fellow men." So it's not on the streets, it's not on the surface realities that you find the real people who one lives with, but they have to be understood through this kind of an exploration, through a kind of imaginative reaching out to understand the real lives of these people, their concerns, their emotions, what makes them who they are, rather than the little symbols through which we try to understand who they are. The most striking example of her critique of this way of objectively analyzing the lives of people through the detective lens, let's call it that, comes in Mrs. Dalloway, where she describes one of the key characters, Septimus Warren Smith, without introducing him to us first. So this is again a technique that the modernists often start using, where unlike in realist fiction, where a character would first be introduced by this neutral narrator to the reader, they would often introduce fragments of a character or fragments of a scene before gradually going on to explain what is actually going on. In an essay on Joseph Conrad, it's referred to as a technique of delayed decoding. So first you have these fragmentary symbols which you may or may not be able to understand, and later on the narrator through some different means explains to you what actually was going on. So this is also a kind of delayed decoding, where the character is not introduced up front, but someone else's impression is given, and you later try to understand through your own reading whether those impressions were in fact correct or whether they were faithful to the person who you have come to recognize. So the narrator adopts the voice of an objective viewer. She writes, To look at, he may have even been a clerk, but of the better sort, for he wore brown boots, his hands were educated, so too his profile, his angular, big-nosed, intelligent, sensitive profile. One of those half-educated, self-educated men whose education is all learnt from books borrowed from public libraries, read in the evening after the day's work, on the advice of well-known authors, consulted by letter. So there is a kind of dismissive air about this description of Septimus Warren Smith, as a highbrow narrator looks at a middlebrow reader and dismisses the kind of education that they have and describes him as some kind of a clerk who is sitting casually around in the park. Later on, as you go on to read the novel, you find out that this is a man who has just returned from the First World War, completely shell-shocked and traumatized. He hallucinates continuously and often sees his friend Evans, who had died at the war front. His doctor has advised him, ironically, to look at real things so that his imagination remains anchored to the real world, a process which his wife Lucrezia helps him with. So Septimus has lost touch with the objective reality that everyone else around him perceives or think they perceive, and he is continuously hallucinating, and this is the solution that the doctor offers. Now you understand why the first impression that Woolf's narrator gives us of him as a clerk, of someone who has learned from the public library, who's just sitting there, is such a shallow kind of description, whereas when we actually get to know the character, we realize how his mind is working, how he is responding to people around him, how he is responding to the situation around him, and it gives you a really insider's perspective into the character. So that is, I think, one of the most important kind of takeaways from the way Virginia Woolf reimagines writing about the city, where you chance upon characters as an outsider, but when you keep reading about them, you do not remain an outsider to these characters, even if they are not central to the narrative. So you become an insider with everyone by exploring these characters, as she was doing in Street Haunting as well. Thus, we see that, like Wordsworth, what Woolf carries over to this new form of writing about the city is the power of one's imagination and empathy that does not reduce others to objective details. It forms a part of a larger critique of patriarchal and militant Western societies, while at the same time opening up avenues for talking about time, space, and a female imagination of the city that moves away from the realistic mode of narration of representation. So, in today's lecture, this is what I have been trying to get at. So, the idea of walking not just as a kind of exciting, enjoyable exercise in itself, but as a kind of empathetic way to read the city. And this is something that I think we can look for when we study Virginia Woolf. And in the next episode, we will be looking at a few other aspects of exploring space, time, and most importantly, memory in Virginia Woolf's fiction. So thank you, and I hope that you have enjoyed this lecture. And if you have any questions, please feel free to write to me at sujaanmukherjee@gmail.com. The email ID will be provided to you by your faculty members. Thank you very much, and until next time.